In The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, the episode titled The Moment Brandon Fugal realized something was watching the investigation arrives with the weight of a warning. Even before the first major anomaly takes shape, the title tells us that this is not simply another test, another late-night field operation, or another attempt to provoke data out of an environment already known for refusing easy explanation. It suggests something more unsettling. It suggests a shift in direction. Because this time, the investigation is not only moving outward toward the unknown, it is being met. That is what makes the opening emotional register of this episode so important. From the start, there is a quiet but unmistakable implication that something has changed in the relationship between the team and the ranch itself. For years, the premise has been built around observation. Instruments, radar sweeps, thermal readings, triangulation data, electromagnetic scans, repeated efforts to measure patterns inside an environment defined by irregularity. But here, the possibility emerges that observation may not be one-directional. And the psychological effect of that idea lands immediately. What this episode taps into is not loud fear. It is something far more controlled and therefore far more effective. It is the discomfort of experienced investigators realizing that the environment they came to study may not be behaving like a passive location at all. That possibility introduces a different kind of tension. The danger is no longer just equipment failure, environmental inconsistency, or unexplained response from sensors. The danger becomes awareness, presence, intent. That is why the episode feels important from its first moments. Not because it promises a spectacular revelation, but because it suggests that an internal line may have been crossed. There is a major difference between encountering anomalies and feeling acknowledged by them. The first can still be filed under mystery. The second begins to move into something more intimate, more destabilizing, and harder to contain within the language of control investigation. And at the center of that shift is Brandon Fugal. His role matters because he is not framed as someone eager to dramatize uncertainty. He represents structure, discipline, authority, and investment. He is one of the key figures through whom the audience measures emotional credibility. So when an episode frames his realization as the defining event, it signals that what happened here was not minor, not ambiguous in an ordinary way, and not easily absorbed into the routine pattern of the ranch. This is what gives the opening its power. The episode is not simply asking whether something unexplained occurred. It is asking something more unnerving. What happens when the people conducting the investigation begin to suspect they are no longer alone in the act of observation? What happens when cameras, sensors, and human attention stop feeling like tools of control and start feeling like invitations? And what does it mean when the person financing the search appears to recognize that the boundary between watcher and watched may no longer be stable? That is the mystery this episode opens with. Not just what the team found, but what might have found them first. There are episode titles that function as summaries, and then there are titles that function as narrative triggers. This one belongs to the second category. The moment Brandon Fugal realized something was watching the investigation does not advertise a result in the conventional sense. It does not point to a specific experiment, a recovered object, or a measurable breakthrough. Instead, it points to a realization, a mental event, a sudden shift in perception. And that choice changes everything about the way the audience enters the episode. The most striking word in the title is not watching. It is realized, because realization implies a before and after. It implies that the same environment looked different once a certain threshold of awareness had been crossed. It means there was a point at which uncertainty stopped being abstract and became personal. Something clicked. Something in the pattern, in the timing, in the reaction, or in the atmosphere no longer felt dismissible. And once that recognition exists, it cannot easily be undone. That is why the title carries such psychological force. It does not merely imply activity on the ranch. It implies interpretation under pressure. It invites the viewer into a moment when evidence and instinct begin to overlap in a way that is deeply uncomfortable. Scientific investigation depends on distance, on repeatability, on separation between observer and subject. But the phrase, "something was watching," erodes that distance almost instantly. It transforms the tone from analytical curiosity to implied surveillance. And surveillance is a very different emotional category from mystery. Mystery leaves room for wonder, ambiguity, even fascination. Surveillance introduces vulnerability. It introduces asymmetry. It raises the possibility that one side sees more than the other. That one side may be anticipating movement, reacting to procedures, or remaining just outside the limits of detection while still exerting pressure on the people conducting the search. That is what gives the title its unusual strength. It frames the episode not as a hunt for answers, but as an encounter with awareness. The question becomes not simply what phenomenon appeared, but whether the phenomenon seemed responsive, whether certain baseline deviations, signal fluctuations, environmental inconsistencies, or sensor irregularities began to feel less random and more timely, less like noise, and more like contact without form. It also centers Brandon specifically, and that choice is strategic. A title like this could have named the team, the ranch, or the experiment. Instead, it isolates one man's recognition. That makes the event feel less like franchise mythology and more like a human threshold moment. We are not being told that the ranch is strange. We already know that is the premise. We are being told that Brandon Fugal, a central figure associated with control, resources, and oversight, reached a point where the pattern no longer felt neutral to him. And that is why the title behaves more like a warning than a recap. It tells the audience to pay attention not just to the visible anomaly, but to the shift in human reaction surrounding it. It suggests that the most important evidence in the episode may not arrive as a dramatic visual at all. It may arrive in the form of stillness, hesitation, the change in someone's voice, the pause before a sentence, the look that passes between people when the environment stops feeling merely strange and starts feeling aware. The title makes a promise before the episode even unfolds. Somewhere in what follows, a line will be crossed. And once it is crossed, the investigation will no longer mean the same thing it meant before. Brandon Fugal occupies a distinctive place in the narrative architecture of The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch. He is not merely present as a personality. He functions as a stabilizing force within a world built around instability. He brings authority, ownership, strategic purpose, and a degree of rational framing that helps ground the series whenever events threaten to drift into speculation. That is precisely why his reaction matters so much in an episode built around realization. In documentary storytelling, credibility is not only built through instruments and data, it is also built through the emotional reliability of the people on screen. Some reactions feel performative, others feel earned. Brandon's significance lies in the fact that his presence is typically associated with restraint. He is not there to be impressed by every anomaly. He is there to evaluate, to support, to oversee, and to understand whether repeated incidents are adding up to something coherent. So when the structure of episode suggests that he reached a deeply unsettling conclusion, the audience instinctively reads that as meaningful. What makes this so compelling is that Brandon's role begins from distance. He is connected to the investigation, but he is also meant to stand slightly apart from its most immediate volatility. That distance gives him symbolic weight. He represents what happens when someone who can normally maintain analytical separation is pulled inward by the force of the experience itself. Once that happens, the ranch is no longer affecting only the investigators in the field. It is affecting the person who embodies control over the operation. That shift transforms him from observer to participant. And in narrative terms, that is a critical escalation. It suggests that what occurred in this episode did not remain safely confined to equipment logs, isolated witness statements, or abstract anomaly reports. It reached the level of direct human impact. It interrupted the posture of detachment. There is also something else at work here. Brandon's reaction is not important because it proves anything absolutely. It is important because it changes the emotional geometry of the scene. If a trained team encounters a thermal anomaly, a baseline deviation, or an unexplained signal response, that is one kind of event. If Brandon watches the same sequence unfold and appears to register not just strangeness but presence, the event acquires a second layer. It becomes psychologically contagious. The meaning changes because the witness changes. This is where the episode title gains greater depth. It is not simply that Brandon saw something unusual. It is that he realized something. A realization is never limited to surface perception. It gathers fragments into a pattern. It reorganizes context. It forces prior assumptions to be reconsidered. In a place like Skinwalker Ranch, where data is often partial and explanations remain contested, realization becomes its own kind of event, especially when it occurs in someone not predisposed to dramatize the unknown. So the emotional center of this episode is not just an anomaly in the field. It is Brandon's moment of interpretive rupture. What did he see, hear, sense, or connect that altered the atmosphere around him? What specific combination of timing and response and unease made the environment feel active rather than incidental? The answer may remain incomplete, but that incompleteness is part of what gives the episode its force. Because when the man funding the search starts to look less like someone managing the investigation and more like someone being drawn into its psychological reach, the story changes. At that point, the ranch is no longer simply being examined. It is beginning to exert influence on the people trying to define it. One of the most effective things this kind of episode can do is begin in a register of procedure, planning, coordination, equipment checks, the familiar grammar of a field investigation. That structure matters because it creates the illusion of control, and control is what gives the later disruption its force. The team appears to be doing what they always do, defining the objective, calibrating the tools, establishing an operational baseline, and moving into position with the assumption that whatever happens will be processed through methodology. This procedural opening is not filler. It is dramatic groundwork, because the quieter the beginning, the more clearly the audience can feel the moment when normal investigation stops being enough. A well-built documentary sequence understands that tension does not begin at maximum intensity. It builds through contrast, through the gap between what everyone expects and what the environment appears to return. That is the emotional function of the setup in an episode like this. The ranch initially presents itself as something to be studied, a site of variables, a landscape of anomalies that can be monitored through triangulation data, thermal imaging, electromagnetic readings, aerial observation, and controlled repetition. Everything about the process suggests that the team is entering another measurable operation, another chance to isolate a pattern, another attempt to reduce the unknown to something observable. And yet, even within that routine, there is a deeper tension. Because on Skinwalker Ranch, procedure often carries a second possibility, provocation. Every instrument introduced into the field is not only a recording device, it is also a signal that attention has arrived. Every repeated experiment is not only an attempt to collect evidence, it is also a form of interaction. And the series repeatedly gains its power from that ambiguity, whether the investigation is merely detecting responses or in some way triggering them. That is why the early phase of the episode should be understood as more than setup. It is the moment in which the audience is quietly positioned inside a false sense of rhythm. People are moving with purpose. The language is technical. Expectations remain disciplined. But beneath that procedural surface, the possibility is already growing that something has begun before anyone has identified it. The encounter may already be underway while the team still believes they are in the preparation stage. This creates a particularly effective kind of suspense. Rather than asking the audience to wait for a visible anomaly, the episode asks them to watch for subtle instability. A pause that feels longer than it should. A reaction that doesn't match the baseline. A sensor irregularity that arrives too early, too precisely, or too contextually to feel meaningless. The key is not spectacle. It is the slow recognition that normal investigative logic is beginning to fray at the edges. And once that sensation takes hold, even the most ordinary elements of the operation start to feel altered. Monitoring stations become nerve centers. Drone shots become overhead surveillance of a place that refuses to stay inert. Night visuals stop feeling atmospheric and start feeling watchful. The environment does not need to produce a dramatic display all at once. It only needs to shift enough for the investigators to realize that the assumptions they began with are no longer holding. That is why the setup is so crucial. It lets the audience experience the same progression the team experiences. At first, this is an operation. Then it becomes a pattern. Then it becomes a question. And before anyone fully understands when it happened, the operation is no longer just an operation. It is an encounter unfolding in real time, disguised as routine until the routine itself starts to feel compromised. Every strong investigative episode has a point where the emotional weather changes. Not necessarily the loudest moment, not necessarily the most visually dramatic, but the moment after which the same environment no longer feels the same. In this episode, that turning point appears to be less about spectacle and more about convergence, a scene, a reaction, a silence, a signal fluctuation, or an unexplained response that suddenly reframes everything around it. What matters here is not just what may have appeared on a screen in the sky or inside a cluster of readings. What matters is how the people on site respond when the pattern stops feeling abstract. This is where documentary storytelling becomes especially powerful, because the key evidence may exist not only in data but in behavior. The camera lingers. Someone stops speaking. A face changes before the words catch up. The body registers what the mind is still trying to process. That is often how genuine shifts happen on screen, not with immediate explanation, but with a rupture in rhythm. The scene slows down without anyone announcing that it has slowed down. The ambient noise becomes more noticeable. Monitoring equipment suddenly looks more ominous not because it has changed, but because the meaning of its output has changed. In that moment, the visual language of investigation starts to merge with the emotional language of intrusion. And that distinction matters. Up to this point, the ranch may still be understood as difficult, unpredictable, and resistant to ordinary explanation. But here, the feeling becomes more pointed. The space stops seeming merely active and starts seeming responsive. That is a completely different category of experience. The power of the turning point lies in how little it may actually need in order to work. It may be a thermal anomaly that appears where it should not, a sensor irregularity that coincides too neatly with human movement or attention, a baseline deviation that emerges at exactly the wrong or right time, a visual cue that on its own might remain ambiguous, but in context becomes impossible to shrug off. These are the moments that generate the deepest unease because they do not offer certainty. They offer pattern under pressure. This is also the point where Brandon's realization becomes central. If the atmosphere changes for him, the scene changes for the viewer. His interpretation becomes part of the evidence, not because subjective reaction replaces technical analysis, but because in documentary terms, the human threshold is what tells us that something has exceeded expectation. Something has crossed from curiosity into personal recognition. And once that happens, the ranch no longer feels passive. It feels present. The field becomes charged not only with technical uncertainty, but with implied intention. Even if nothing overtly threatening occurs, the entire emotional structure of the episode shifts. The team is no longer simply working inside an unusual environment. They are navigating the possibility that the environment is, in some way, aware of their presence. That is the exact moment the atmosphere changes. The moment when the question is no longer, what are we detecting? But why does this feel like it is happening in relation to us? And that is the moment that tends to linger long after the scene itself is over. The most disturbing idea in this episode is not the existence of an anomaly. It is the possibility of asymmetry. The sense that while the team is attempting to monitor the ranch through cameras, sensors, radar, and repeated experiment design, something within that environment may be tracking them in return without ever presenting itself clearly enough to be defined. That is what transforms observation into surveillance. This is where the episode deepens from mystery into psychological tension. Surveillance implies orientation. It implies attention that is focused, not random. And once the concept enters the frame, every investigative tool starts to feel different. Cameras are no longer only recording devices. They become symbols of a struggle for visual control. Monitoring stations are no longer just analytical hubs. They become defensive spaces from which the team is trying to understand whether their own actions are being mirrored, anticipated, or answered. That is why the fear here remains so controlled and yet so effective. There is no need for dramatic panic. The discomfort comes from the inability to establish where the point of attention originates. No visible observer, no fixed source, no confirmed mechanism. Just a pattern of environmental inconsistency and timing that begins to feel too relational to dismiss. This is also where human perception becomes part of the narrative field. Once the idea of being watched takes hold, every silence acquires pressure. Every unexplained pause in signal behavior feels heavier. A minor sensor irregularity becomes more than a technical note. It becomes part of a possible chain of response. The team may still speak in measured, scientifically grounded terms: electromagnetic disturbance,